I hope everybody is happy, healthy, excited about their day, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. All right. So, as of today, when I'm recording this, it's 10 days till my TEDx talk. And when you guys listen to it, it'll be 6 days till my TEDx talk. And it's been a wild ride. I think I mentioned before they had a few changes they wanted me to make to my talk, and we're still kind of going back and forth on some of those. So it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out. But I'm pretty excited. Patty and I are leaving today to go to Mexico. I am with Patty. We're both here in Kanab, Utah, except for he's pretty sick. He's got a bad cold, so that kind of stinks, especially since we're leaving for. It's kind of a vacation, but we're also marrying our very good friends Sean and Mel, and so we're excited about that. But today I want to talk again. I'm just going to be doing this one all by my lonesome. I want to talk about one of my favorite parts of my TEDx talk that I don't really get to elaborate on much, and that's all the benefits of sex. So you may not realize this consciously, but subconsciously you'll probably start to relate to it. But sex is really, really good for you. It's really good for your health. It's really good for your relationship. And it's really good for your happiness and your longevity. So I'm just going to roll through some of my favorite ones. I have this slide in my TEDx talk, and it has about 20, I think it's about 21 to do. Yeah, probably about 20 different benefits of sex. And that slide's backed up by more than 65 scientific research studies. So these are all backed by some kind of research. And I just want to talk about them. I want to start with sleep. So, it's funny when Patty and I were having trouble with our sex life because he always wanted to do it and I never did. One of my go-to excuse wasn't the headache. We'll talk about headaches in a minute, but my go-to excuse was that I'm tired. I'm always tired, especially when the kids were young and I was, we're both working full-time jobs and our household responsibilities and dragging the kids all around. Like by the end of the day, I was spent. And so I would say, "Oh, I'm so tired." So, sleep. He'd say, "Sleep's more important than sex." And I'd be like, "Yes." But you know what? There are studies that show that um, when you have sex, and especially if you orgasm, your body gets flooded with this chemical called prolactin. And prolactin does a lot of things, but one of the things that it does is it makes you sleepy. So if you have sex right before bed, you will fall asleep faster. The research also shows that you will stay asleep longer. And for women, I don't think they've proven this in men, but for women, your REM sleep, you're going to experience more REM sleep, which is the sleep that's the restful bit, the part that where your body heals and it's super restful. So I think if Patty had known that and had said, "Well, baby, you know, if we have sex, you're going to sleep better." I and I've and I've seen it actually. I've seen a few studies. I haven't read them, but where sex is one of those things they recommend for insomniacs, to try using sex to help people fall asleep and stay asleep longer. So if Patty had said, "Hey, if we have sex, you're going to sleep better, which means you'll wake up more rested," I might have I might have given into that one. It also boosts your immune system. And you probably, again, like the sleep thing, many people already, you can feel that, a lot of times. You get a nice kind of sleepy buzz after you've had an orgasm with your lover. The immune system also can be improved with sex. There was a research study where they found that people, after they had had sex, there's something called immunoglobulin A that they were finding in their saliva in greater amounts which is part of the immune system, an indicator of how well your immune system is functioning. Um, so it boosts your immunities. There are other studies, but it's a lot of science for a non-scientist like myself to remember all the studies. But anyway, it boosts your immunities, which is awesome. It and if you think about sex, some of the benefits are things that you experience, right? Like sex is exercise. Most of us get that. We feel that when we're having sex, and it boosts our mood. Again, you're flooded with all of these feel good hormones like oxytocin and dopamine. And so that boosts your mood and it lowers stress. And then if you think about that, those three things also lower your blood pressure and your risk for cardiovascular disease, heart disease. So those are also, so the exercise is a benefit, the reduces stress is a huge benefit. Again, they've measured cortisol and cortisol levels before and after sex, as well as its reactivity when you're doing something stressful. So you want to your cortisol goes up in during stressful events, but then you want it to be reactive in that when you want it to your cortisol level to go down quickly after the stressful event or whatever is happening, and so that that cortisol doesn't linger. And there was a study that showed that when after people had had some sort of sexual activity, that their cortisol reaction was better than without the sex. So it's pretty cool that they can measure all this fantastic stuff. So it reduces stress, boosts your mood. It's exercise. It does lower blood pressure. There's been a number of studies also about the heart disease health. It's interesting. These studies started out. There's one in Thailand, there was one in the UK, and there's been a couple in the US. But the ones that were done overseas, these studies started out as longevity studies. They were trying to figure out if sex was tied to a longevity because they were gathering large amounts of data over multiple years, like between 10 and 20 years. And they collected all this data and this found that the frequency of sex seemed to correlate with a person's lifespan because the people who were having sex more frequently were living longer, which then led them to figure out, like, why is that happening? And some of it can be explained by the cardiovascular health that these people were experiencing. And again, it's like the cart and the horse, like which one's the chicken, which one's the egg? Do they have better cardiovascular health, which allows them to have sex more frequently, or is the frequent sex creating the cardiovascular health? Well, there was one study that was published in the, and I'm not sure that there's any conclusive evidence either way, but it's nice to know, or it's good to know that, if you can figure out how to get yourself healthy enough to have sex fairly frequently, that your risk for cardiovascular disease will go down. But there was one study that was published in the American Journal of Cardiology that showed that men who had sex at least twice a week, 2 to 3 times a week, they had a 45% lower risk for cardiovascular disease than men who were having sex once a month or less. So I find that very interesting. And there's been another study that showed that for women, it isn't the frequency. It isn't the frequency of sexual activity that makes a difference, but the quality. So the quality of a woman's sex life is more protective against cardiovascular disease and lowers her blood pressure. So it can't just be sex all the time for women. It has to be good sex, whatever that means for you, satisfying sex. So I thought it's interesting too, like, throughout the years, I think I've mentioned this, they've been doing research on men and just sort of applying that to women. But as it turns out, that doesn't really work. We're pretty different. It's interesting how that shakes out even in this idea of cardiovascular disease risk and blood pressure and sex. There are also studies that show sex boosts your cognition. They have done these tests where some of it's tied to fantasy, when sometimes when we're having sex, we fantasize to create you know, a really exciting um, experience for ourselves, and how our imaginations are pretty good during and after sex. And they also did some tests in women that showed that they could retain information longer after having sexual intercourse or for having frequent sex. So that's pretty cool. It boosts your confidence. A lot of people probably know that, but that was one of the that's actually one of the when they were studying one night stands and if there were any benefits to those, that was one of the things that came out of it, was that people felt pretty confident after they had a one night stand. Let's see what else is on this list. A newer study came out that showed it improves job satisfaction and performance. And I don't think I read through the entire list, but I mean, it makes sense that if your mood is boosted, if your stress is lowered, if you're feeling confident and you can remember more. I mean, it just like you start looking at them and you're like, yeah, they're all interrelated. They all work together to create these very awesome benefits. It also limits pain. um, Doctors Beverly Whipple and Barry Komisaruk, they have done a lot of studies. Well, some with rats and but many more with humans. In fact, I think Dr. Komisaruk was the first person to ever see an MRI of a woman's brain when she was having an orgasm, and they've learned a lot about sex and orgasm through those, and how the brain interacts with that through these studies. Fascinating stuff too about people who have spinal cord cuts can still have orgasms even though they don't really have sensation in those parts of their bodies, but their bodies rewire somehow the those those receptors so that they can still, without going through the spine, so they can still achieve orgasm. And I think that's pretty cool. So they've been studying that kind of thing. But one of the things that they found is that sex, not specifically sex, but vaginal stimulation and orgasm, they both block pain. It makes sense when you think about the vaginal stimulation because women have babies and that's extremely painful. And it makes sense that the body would have its own natural painkiller to help women get through that. So it makes sense that vaginal stimulation would block pain. And it's nice that orgasm does that as well. So that they've shown that it can block chronic back pain. And my adorable mother, who suffers badly from chronic back pain, I was telling her, Mom, if you sex and vaginal stimulation, it blocks chronic back pain. And she said, Yes, I know, dear. So there you go. Not only did they prove it in the labs, but my mom says so too. So it must be true. And then it also can block menstrual cramps. And I read another study that said the testosterone um, in semen, in yeah, the testosterone in semen is also can block cramps. So if you can get yourself to do it on your period, which I know some people think is gross, but there's always the shower, and so if I'm having a lot of cramps, I will often be like, honey, because I don't take painkillers or I don't take any kind of medication anymore. So I love all these natural remedies, especially if it involves some intimacy with my honey. So we do that. I use that as a painkiller for my own menstruation. The other thing that the other kind of pain it blocks is headaches. So in Germany, um, a researcher by the name of Anke Hambach, she published a report in Cephalalgia, which is the International Headache Journal. I didn't even know there was such a thing. But what she found was that most people who are suffering from headaches, and she was specifically studying people with migraines and cluster headaches, most people who are suffering from those kinds of headaches, the first thing she found was that most of them aren't having sex. They're not engaging in sexual activity when they're having those attacks. And I would say, duh. I mean, it's like it's the number one, excuse for not having sex. I have a headache, dear. But what she did find was that of those people who did bring themselves to engage in sex, for the migraine sufferers, a majority of those people who did engage in sex and reach orgasm had moderate to full relief from the migraine after orgasm. That, if you've ever had a migraine, and I only had them when I was pregnant, and they were fucking awful. I mean, I would have definitely tried that. I would definitely have tried that to try to relieve those headaches. And in the cluster headaches, it wasn't quite as effective, but still, like, I think it was close to 40% of people had experienced moderate to full relief of those headaches. So next time you have a headache, well, first of all, I apologize to all of the people who use that as an excuse and who listen to this. I'm sorry that that excuse probably isn't a great one anymore. And I want to say you're welcome to all of the people who use the headache excuse. um, because now you can say, well, gosh, it might, if we have sex and you have an orgasm, it might help your headache because it's true. Science says so. What else? Oh, all right. So there's a lot of research showing that sex improves intimacy, and it's interesting. So when you get into the science of it, you're like, well, it's great that it improves intimacy, but the science is very specific. So I was like, what exactly does intimacy mean? And as it turns out, there's a study that showed it was basically describing what people thought intimacy meant. And for men, sex itself means intimacy, which is very interesting. I mean, that's an interesting thing to understand, that just the sex is the intimacy. But that isn't how women that isn't necessarily how women define it. And for men too, to be fair, um, it's sex, but then it's also any physical intimacy, touching, cuddling, kissing, those kinds of things. For women, it's more, we consider intimacy to be more of the affectionate touching, but mostly it's emotional. So I think most people understand, if you consider sex, I mean, sex is probably the most intimate act there is on the planet, right? You're literally inside one another. So from that perspective, sex is intimacy. But what's interesting is the studies that show um, not just the act of sex, but kind of the afterglow and what happens during like 24 to 48 hours after sex, which is couples maintain kind of a connection where they touch each other more. They're more affectionate to one another. There's more kissing. There's also a researcher by the name of Amanda Dennis, who she doesn't research sex specifically. She actually is at the University of Connecticut, and she studies communication. And so she studies communication after sex, which is great. And she found that pillow talk, it's a real thing. After you've had sex, you're more likely to self-disclose. You're more likely to open up to someone. And it's, they're not exactly sure why it happens, but they think it's because of the oxytocin that's released in the brain, which has been called the love hormone, the love drug, the cuddle drug. I'm pausing because there was another study that I read that showed there was a study that showed that oxytocin increased trust, and then I read two other studies that said it didn't. So I don't know if it does or it doesn't, but but this but this Dr. Dennis is finding that pillow talk is a real thing. You do self-disclose. Sometimes it's negative, like you're telling somebody, something bad you did, but sometimes it's positive and positive even towards the relationship. And that actually, the positive self-disclosure was more likely to happen after orgasm. And I think she's attributing that to testosterone. So there you go. I have rambled on and on. I don't even know how long I've been recording, but it feels like I've been talking a lot. There are other studies that show um, it makes you happier than money. I just want to cover all these because I don't get to cover them in my TEDx talk. I don't have time. I have 10 minutes, although I'm going to go over a little bit, but I have 10 minutes. I don't get to talk about all this cool shit I know, but I am going to put it in so Patty and I are re-releasing our book. So our book was Bigger Love, How to Have the Love of Your Life for the Rest of your life. The new book is Marriage from Miserable to Magnificent. Keep the love of your life for the rest of your life. And it's the same book, except that we've added all of this scientific research. And that book, it covers not just sex, but it covers all the different parts of a relationship. But I want to write one specifically about sex and about this idea of the benefits of sex and changing the way we make the decision about having sex. So I'm working on that, and in that I want to talk about all these things. But so that's also in the works. But let me just finish what I'm talking about. I'm all over the place. Okay, so sex makes you happier than money. Amy Muse, who runs it's the Sexual Health and Relationships Lab up in Canada. So she found that when she was evaluating sex and satisfaction of sex as compared to satisfaction with other parts of other parts of the life, I can't remember exactly how it worked. They had some questions that, like, how happy are you? How does your sex life affect your, overall satisfaction of your well-being and your general life? And the same with money. And they found that people were more interested in having satisfactory sex lives than getting $50,000 more annual income a year. I guess if I say annual, that means a year. So that's crazy, right? They're saying that sex is more important than 50,000 bucks more income a year. I mean, and that's and then there's another thing. It's called it's something that they're doing in the UK, and it's well-being a well-being index where they do a whole bunch of um, polls, basically research, where they're asking people questions about what makes them happy, and what contributes most to their well-being as a human. And the number one thing is sleep. But guess what number two is? Yep, sex, satisfactory sex. And then you have all the other things like job satisfaction and whatever, all those other things that contribute to well-being. So that's pretty awesome. It makes you look younger. That's another claim. There are a couple of books that came out that talk about this, and another researcher who claimed that he had done a whole bunch of interviews and comparisons, and he came up with statistics that said is if you were having sex 2 to 3 times a week, you would look 7 to 10 years younger. And I couldn't really find any solid research that backed that. However, um, it's published quite a bit on the web, and he did put out a book talking about the scientific ways scientific ways to look younger, feel younger, that kind of a book. But there are other people who have done research that shows that when you have an orgasm as a woman, you release estrogen, and estrogen promotes collagen, which then makes your skin look younger. So again, that's solid research that backs up the idea that, your skin will be healthier looking and you will look younger from sex. That also, the other things too, like boosts your mood, reduces stress. All those things also contribute to your skin, your overall health, your well being. Again, they're all interrelated. All right. So I think I've covered all of these. Longevity, I think I talked about that. People are living much longer when they're having often sex. And I have on here that it saves relationships. And I think this is true. I think, and again, I don't know that there's any specific research other than, people are saying that marital satisfaction um, is as important. Actually, let's go back. Sexual satisfaction leads to marital satisfaction and marital stability. However, marital satisfaction, although it leads to marital stability, it doesn't necessarily lead to sexual satisfaction. And as we said, like sex is very important to people in their lives for their well-being. And if you're not having sex in your relationship, or you're not having good sex in your relationship, at some level someone is feeling like they're suffering through that. And if you can figure out a way to come back to making that decision differently, if you can get out of your own head and recognize you might have responsive desire, and give this to your partner, as a loving acceptance of them, and as a gift to your relationship, and as a gift to yourself, to not for your own health and your longevity and ultimately your happiness. Um, it will be worth it. Okay. And on that note, I'm going to sign off. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.